Good afternoon and welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is Abbas Kadhim. I'm the director of the Iraq Initiative at the Atlantic Council in Washington. We are discussing today a timely subject on Iraq's regional role as it is evolving in post-2003 and the current domestic struggle that Iraqi politics are facing. And it's a concern of many Iraq watchers, and we will discuss those two topics. This is a public event. Feel free to post on social media any parts of the or reflections on what is being discussed, and also it is an event where we are going to look at beyond these two topics any other relevant aspects that relate to Iraq. Iraq has made a 180-degree turn from its pre-2003 history and especially the immediate years prior to 2003, when the country was a pariah state, sanctioned and boycotted by about every member of the United Nations. And Iraqis were facing a brutal dictatorship, to a journey towards democratization and also an evolving international and regional role where the country is not only embraced by its neighbors, or most of them, but also moved from being the problem regionally and internationally to a problem solver, or at least a helpful partner in solving regional and international problems. And our distinguished guests are going to discuss that. We are fortunate to have a great panel with us to discuss these issues. And we have Omar Nadawi, Director of Programs at Enabling Peace in Iraq Center. And we have Catherine Harvey, Adjunct Professor of Security Studies Program at Georgetown University. We have Shamiran Mako, Assistant Professor of International Relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. And last but not least, David Darush, the professor at Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. So without further ado, let me address some of the issues of today's agenda and start with Dr. Catherine Harvey. Catherine, give us a reflections or your reflections or observations on those two issues, and mainly I'm interested to know your thoughts on the recent Jeddah summit, where Iraq participated in an important regional conference by the Gulf Cooperation Council, and it was a GCC +4, where in addition to the members of the GCC, the United States, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt were invited to be represented by their heads of state. And it was a great success for the region, for its integration and interconnectivity, but also it was for Iraq. It was especially important for what the outcome of the conference or summit in relation to what the final communique mentioned regarding Iraq. Also, the couple of other agreements that were signed, and as a sign of Iraq's diversifying and balancing its regional relations and also what they mean for the future of Iraq as a regional, active regional actor.
Thank you, Abbas, and thank you to the Atlantic Council. And I'm delighted to be here with you this afternoon. And it's a great topic. And I mean, I think it really does show the evolution that has taken place with Iraq. So the U.S. sort of calls its friends in the region, GCC plus. So the U.S. billed this conference as, a summit of the GCC +3. As Dr. Abbas points out, it should really, you can really be seen as the GCC +4 if you consider, the United States as the fourth member. When the U.S. comes to the region, when the president comes to the region, he as it's likes to meet with all of his Arab friends. It used to be the GCC +2. It was Jordan and Egypt, and it's a really positive step that it's the GCC +3 now with Iraq. And I think that it shows that, Iraq has been, not only that Iraq has really built bridges to its Arab neighbors, to all of its regional, to all of its neighbors, but that, it's been accepted by the region. And, this is a big change, a big shift from, just, 10 years ago, 8 years ago. It's my argument in my own personal research that actually, if you look at the post-2003 period, the Iraqis were actually always sort of reaching out to their Arab neighbors. A Shia-led Iraq was always going to have sort of a special relationship with Iran. But just because of the relationship with Iran, that didn't mean that Iraqi Shia leaders didn't also want strong, positive relationships, with their Arab neighbors. That was just sort of, taken for granted that Iraq as an Arab state, should reintegrate itself into the Arab world. And it's been my argument that that oftentimes it was the Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia in my own research, that was really very wary towards a new Shia-led Iraq, and ultimately took steps to isolate Iraq, which only enhanced its dependence, on Iran. But that was then. This is now. There's, Saudi Arabia has embraced the new Iraq, and again, this summit demonstrates, the extent to which, Iraq has been integrated into the region. And I think it also, just Iraq's, I think that Iraq's natural role in the region will be as a mediator, having this special relationship with Iran, but, very much wanting the relationship with the Arab states and seeing itself as an integral member of the Arab states, and recognizing that, there are plenty of Arab states in Iran that have had sort of historical animosities. It's Iraq's natural place in the region to try to bring all of these players together. And you see, and of course, in the past, year and a half almost, we see that Khatami has done this. And whoever replaces Khatami as prime minister, it's certainly a strength of Khatami is that he personally has, very positive relationships with, a number of key players in the region. So that's, certainly a personal strength of Khatami as prime minister. But whoever replaces Khatami, and even if that's somebody from, the coordination framework, I see that this tendency to bring the two sides together is not going to go away. This is sort of an enduring interest on the part of the Iraqis. And I think that, even just today, I think last night, Amar al-Hakim, who's a key member of the coordination framework, who is somebody who's been more associated with Iran. He last night just arrived in Saudi Arabia. And actually, if you look at sort of his rhetoric over the course of years, he's been somebody who's tried to reach out to Sunni Arabs, into the Sunni Arab world, and I think it's, of enormous symbolic value that he is currently in Saudi Arabia, and, is just indicative of, of the Iraqis reaching out to their Arab neighbors. And so with that, I will leave it at that.
Well, thank you. We'll come back to you on some of these issues, and let me turn to Umar Nadawi. Umar, what Catherine was talking about as successes and certainly positive issues for Iraq's image, for Iraq's role, and also their reflection on even Iraqi domestic politics. But this success and this balancing and the regional relations are always not a subject of consensus among the Iraqi domestic or Iraqi internal actors. Some people have different views and different vision, different preferences. A lot of it had to do with, first, their attitudes towards a certain neighbor of Iraq or another. Also, the history of Iraq with its neighbors, which is not always a perfect history. It had a checkered record on whether it's Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, and etc. So, can you really map out how that success to the outside world is playing into the Iraqi conflicting domestic agendas and domestic preferences among the key actors and key decision makers inside Iraq?
Thank you, Dr. Abbas, and it's a pleasure to be here today with such distinguished colleagues. This is a great topic, and I think there's a lot to talk about here. I'll probably present a little bit more of a pessimistic view or a pessimistic assessment of the regional diplomatic role that Iraq is playing, especially under the government of Prime Minister Kaldami. I think yesterday I think there was an important remark in this regard from Dr. Ali Allawi, the resigning finance minister in Kaldami's government, and Dr. Allawi pointed out that that while these regional diplomatic outreach efforts have been perhaps promising, have had promising results in when it comes to long-term development and long-term improvement in relations among Iraq's neighbors, the tangible results for Iraqis themselves, are probably going to be a little underwhelming, and the progress has so far not been, has not shown results when it comes to checking foreign interference in Iraq's affairs. I think the point that you mentioned regarding how Iraqi domestic actors look at neighbors is particularly important. When we look at the achievements from events such as the recent Jeddah conference, the tangible results are of rather limited value, least common denominator kind of things, such as the grid interconnections between Iraq and the GCC, between Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt, things that no one really have a strong interest in counteracting or in being hostile towards. But when we look at more strategic projects in the past that Iraq and some of its Arab neighbors have tried to bring about, such as the Basra Aqaba pipeline, and that's an important oil project that was going to relieve the pressure on Iraq from the from the constraints of the Hormuz Straits, or significant Saudi plans for investments in agricultural business in Iraq, hundreds of thousands of acres. Let's talk about, for example, the international highway connecting Iraq and Jordan. All of these have been are projects that have been attacked viciously by the domestic political actors in Iraq that are associated, or let's say, more closely associated with Iran than others. So there are limits to what Iraq can do, and I think that that inability or that weakness in Iraq's government ability to enforce things within its own borders, whether it comes to whether it relates to trade agreements or to delivering on security concerns of its partners, of its neighbors, PKK and Sinjar and whatnot. That all undermines, I think, the Iraq's ability to, present value for its neighbors when it comes to the issues that are, critical and beyond the low-hanging fruit, such as, grid connections. So obviously, I think the elephant in the room is right now the situation that's unfolding in Baghdad with the opposing sit-ins in the Green Zone, the protests by followers of Muqtada Sadr and by the followers of the coordination framework, and really the fact that Iraq's seat of government has been more or less occupied and turned into a field of battle so far in the Cold War between these opposing factions. And then I think this greatly undermines confidence in Iraq's ability to be not just a broker, but a partner that can deliver on its words. So unless this situation really is resolved in a way that preserves and restores Iraq's, place as an actor that controls its own government, controls its own capital, I think we're probably not going to see this momentum in Iraq's diplomatic regional efforts, be able to be sustained in the long term. I'll pause here.
Thank you, Omar. These are very important topics, and certainly we'll go over them, and particularly the what you mentioned about the Ali Alawi resignation and what it means. And this is a very important development in the last 24 hours to 36 hours. And let me move to Dave Darush. Dave, tell me, here, I'm interested to see how how Washington views the recent Iraqi role, and Prime Minister Kadhimi was one of the few leaders who had a one-on-one meeting with President Joe Biden. The press conference after that was mostly positive. President Biden did point out that Iraq needed to form a government in timely fashion and to be able to serve the Iraqi people, but also highly commended Iraq's new role, especially the issue of interconnectivity with electricity. There is also the Iraq's role in mediation and several other positive aspects of Iraq. So it was really a great opportunity. How is Washington viewing that Iraqi role in the region, and also balancing that with what the reports that come from people on the ground about the struggle towards forming a government, which is not new for Iraq. After every election, we had the government formation drags for months and never failed to do so after any of the past elections. So how is Washington looking at that and their reaction to it?
So that's a great question. Let me start off by first off thanking the other panelists for the insight I've already gathered from them, and especially recognizing Shamran, who hasn't spoken, but who's in the department where Richard Norton, the great scholar of Shiism, mostly in Lebanon, who was my undergraduate supervisor, used to teach before his untimely passing. So I want to start off by looking at geography, because Washington, is realist. And the geography of Iraq makes Iraq an important country regardless of the policy. Historical analysis of the Middle East has always said that for a Middle East country to be truly powerful, it has to have water, people, and oil. And Iraq is the only country that has all three. So that would suggest that Iraq is always going to be an important power. When you look at the lows of Iraq in U.S. policy, I would argue that's probably from the late Bush administration, a period of internecine war where people forget this, but Joe Biden was one of the advocates for dividing Iraq into 3 nation states and then just walking away from it. We've moved from that to a general consensus that Iraq can be a functional state, but it will probably be a state with profound differences. As Omar's noted, Iraq is not a sovereign state in the Weberian sense, in the classic sense that it has a monopoly on the use of legitimate force within its borders. The Kurdish entity in the north, of course, has always been sort of exceptional, and there are, armed factions paid by the Iraqi state who tend to be more loyal to Iran than to Iraq. But that's been the case for over a decade now. And what we've seen is we've gone from when I was in the Pentagon at the start of the 2010s, where every high-level delegation to the Gulf had to try to convince Gulf partners to not blockade, in effect, not freeze out the Iraqi states, to welcoming them as a peer nation, as a nation that can contribute. I want to take exception with the idea that things like connecting to the grid are small things. I'm sort of an advocate of the functionalist school of international relations. It's quite possible that you can move from small to big, particularly in the realm of critical economic things like electricity, just as we saw the European Union move out of the European steel and coal community. It's possible we could get a closer integration, but the problems at the core of the Iraqi state remain. And these are problems from having three different ethnic groups that continue to kind of view politics as winner takes all, and view democracy as two wolves and a sheep discussing what they're going to have for lunch. Those can be overcome. It is possible to have a country, with multiple nations. I mean, my own parents are Canadian, so my father is from the French nation in Canada, and my mother is from the English nation in Canada. Canada is a very prosperous state with its own dynamic entity. But the issue is the ongoing external interference in there. And I think that the Gulf states, under American prodding, have wisely shifted from the point that let's just isolate them and treat them as a contagious patient to let's treat them as a patient who can be treated, and try to, moving small to big, remove the impediments to true Iraqi sovereignty. I don't know if I'll live long enough to see that happen, but let me close with my opening point. The geography of Iraq makes it a priority, regardless of what the government is. And what is positive is seeing Iraqi dealt with as a partner to be helped, not as a nation which has to be blockaded.
Well, thank you, Dave, and I second your point on Iraq's geography. And as a historian, I might say also and the history of Iraq, which is an important component of the regional history and shaping every stage in that history. Before I turn to Shamiran, I would like to remind our distinguished audience that who are with us on Zoom, please feel free to post any questions in the question and answer section on your screen, and then I will look at them and have them asked whether they are to a specific panelist regarding what they said, or about the topic in general, or something we don't cover. We will try to get to as many questions as we can. Normally there are many questions because of a large audience, but we are looking forward to your questions and your participation and input on today's important discussion. Shamiran, I can only echo Dave in our regard to your scholarship and your person. And we know, I need to note, I don't know if you're not announced that yet or not, we are all looking forward to your Cambridge book that is coming sometime soon, hopefully. And it's on an important topic regarding Iraqi identity issues and minorities and how various Iraqi groups are viewing themselves on the other. And also, you just came back from Iraq, and that makes you probably the freshest on Iraq experience than the rest of us. I was in Iraq in between February and April. So always we welcome fresh views and observations from Iraq. I would like to start by asking you to tell us about your observations, your reflections on also what you saw on Iraqi domestic issues, especially in the northern parts of Iraq, and particularly in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and also what you picked up while you were there regarding the issues we are discussing, and also any other aspects that you find worthy to mention.
Thank you so much, Abbas, for inviting me, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting this really important panel, and to my co-panelists. I've learned a lot already. I think in line with today's panel, these thoughts came about because, as you mentioned, Abbas, based on my recent trip to northern Iraq. But I think in thinking more comprehensively about the question of Iraq's potential as a strategic and both regional and international partner, and really in a way as a mediating force, in many ways is inextricably kind of linked to really its position in the Arab world. And I think that historically has always been the case. I think over the past 2 decades, we've kind of come to see so many of the region's problems unfold in Iraq since 2003, but I kind of actually think that that's always been the case, at least since 1979 and the Iranian Revolution, the Iran-Iraq War, the Gulf War, et cetera. And so I think in terms of its position, I think as Dave said and others have mentioned, Iraq really does pose this kind of important strategic partner for both regional states and international states as well. However, I think I want to highlight 3 kind of overlapping crises. And this kind of speaks to some of the issues that Omar was bringing, that brought to our attention earlier, that I think in so many ways places Iraq at this critical nexus point, both in terms of its domestic stability, but also in its regional and international standing. And the first is kind of linked to, on a domestic level, its governing capacity and its kind of ability to provide basic public goods and services. The second is this kind of massive institutional reform that has to happen, that needs to move beyond patronage rule that perpetuates this kind of elite state capture that we've seen. And I think, as you mentioned, Abbas, Dr. Alawi's recent resignation really speaks truth to power, to the pervasiveness of these issues and the ways in which they've stifled government. And the third is something that my co-panelists have brought about, which is this question of Iraq's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and its loss of really control over its coercive capacity. And so to the first point, I think in terms of Iraq's ability to govern, I think what we've seen with the most recent political deadlock, with this kind of, going into 11 months of no government formation after elections, it really kind of reinforces public distrust. And this public distrust in both state institutions, local institutions, subnational institutions, and in many ways, we're seeing, citizens seeing elections less as a vehicle for, change and more as a vehicle for state capture. And we're seeing this both at the national and subnational level, and I'm happy to speak to that more in the Q&A. And if we look at kind of Arab barometer data in terms of Iraqis' public opinions and perceptions, it's quite dismal in terms of where Iraqis see where the government is heading, but also their level of dissatisfaction with government in general. And that's been a declining trend actually for the past few years. 2, with respect to patronage and the ways in which it kind of stifled politics, as in it's actually captured politics. We see this happening both at the local, subnational, and national level. And we're now seeing it kind of mostly manifest through intra-communal divisions. So this kind of rivalries between key Shia, for example, political power blocks, intra-Sunni competition, right, over control of certain government ministries and things like that. But also really crucial to this, the ways in which government formation has been stifled, is intra-Kurdish rivalry. And there's a history behind that, right, that dates back to the 1990s and so on. But that in and of itself has severe implications for not only citizens in the Kurdistan region, but also in the ways in which it stifles government formation in Baghdad, right? As the KDP and PUK really disagree and grapple with who the next presidential nominee is going to be. And the third and kind of last points, and I'll close then so we can get to our audience, is that Iraq's inability to maintain its sovereignty and territorial integrity is really an outcome of 2 factors. And I can't stress these factors enough. One, on a domestic level, the kind of proliferation of armed non-state actors, militias backed by Iran and other kind of regional actors have really affected the government's ability to actually exert control. And by exerting control comes stability. And we're kind of seeing pockets of deep instability in Iraq that have really affected its sovereignty. The other kind of factor related to this is this kind of lack of coordination and cohesion between Iraqi security forces and Kurdish security forces operating in Iraqi Kurdistan, you know, the Peshmerga and the SAH. And there's a kind of a history of distrust of why that is. But I think the more the rift grows there, the more we're seeing these pockets of instability. Going back to David's point about geography matters, is that those pockets of instability in the disputed territories where these two kind of armed, you know, subnational state, the subnational armed forces and national armed forces don't see eye to eye, we're seeing this kind of growing instability in those areas. And I think that growing instability has produced a couple of outcomes that we're seeing kind of affecting Iraqi citizens and especially minority populations. On the one hand, Turkish incursions into northern Iraq have really kind of sparked this new wave of displacement in places like Sinjar and the disputed territories and parts of the northern region as well. And we're seeing that in its effect on civilian populations, most recently with the bombing at the Zakhlo resort that killed 9 Iraqi civilians and injured scores of others, a lot of them vacationers from the south. These military incursions have also severely impacted minority populations, Yazidis in Sinjar, the Turkmen in different parts of Iraq's disputed territories, Assyrians in the Nineveh Plains, and so on. And if we look at data in terms of, you know, geospatial data of the impact that these incursions and these military campaigns are having, looking at Uppsala Conflict Data Program data and ACLED data, these military campaigns are becoming more severe. They're growing in scope and they're growing in terms of geographic distribution. And I think that, you know, Turkish incursions into Iraq aren't new. They've been happening since the 1990s, but there's certainly a kind of growth in the severity. And I think all of that has really stifled and hampered both security in these areas and citizen flight from these areas. And so to conclude, and I'm kind of happy, and these are some of the observations that I saw when I was, you know, in my most recent trip, in terms of how these things are kind of panning out in these areas. But to conclude, I think to kind of sum up from what my colleagues are saying is, you know, no state is really an island, right? And the state's domestic stability is really linked to its regional environment. And if there's one thing that we know from this kind of extensive literature that's out there, is that regional states contribute to domestic instability. And so, you know, going back to the kind of overall theme of the panel in terms of, you know, looking at Iraq's contribution to regional stability and mediation and its role on the international stage as well, I think regional states have to value Iraq's potential. And to do so, there has to be a concerted effort by regional actors and key stakeholders, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other kind of GCC states, to bolster Iraq's sovereignty, but importantly, its domestic stability. And I think these two things are really kind of, they go hand in hand in this case. And I think in you know, weak and fragile states like Iraq, these multiple overarching crises have kind of stifled its potential as a result. And so, and at least its potential in becoming this kind of key mediating force. And so I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to kind of answer questions in the Q&A.
Thank you. And value, not only value Iraq's potential, but also not to work on the assumption that the current conditions of Iraq are going to remain indefinitely. Iraq, for those who know the history of Iraq, and I'm not referring to the 7,000-year history, but even the recent history as a nation state that was established just 101 years ago, it has seen many ups and downs, and always came from out of or rose from the ashes of itself to make something strong or stronger. So I think it is in the interest of the region to look at the current conditions of Iraq and the current fragility for what it is. It is temporary. And with the Iraqi potential financially, in the human resources, demographically, that is, and other potential, it would be advisable for everybody in the neighborhood and beyond to really look at Iraq for what it is going to be in the future, near future, that is, than looking at the current situation in the country. And again, I thank the panel for their introductory remarks, and everybody probably is interested in diving into specific issues. And I think what is on everybody's mind is the recent important topics. One of them is the turmoil at the domestic politics regarding the government formation and the dispute that took a different turn than previous elections, but also the most recent and most important, I would think, development in the last hours of or last couple of days, which is Professor Ali Allawi's resignation and his letter that he wrote and what it represents. I had the honor of working with Professor Allawi on multiple occasions, and I got to know him personally and also followed his political and professional career as one of the really top Iraq experts that made it to the international stage. And speaking of him being on the international stage, we all and we still actually believe that it was one of best Prime Minister Kadhimi's decisions was to bring Professor Allawi to give him that important portfolio, the Ministry of Finance and also the Deputy Prime Minister for Economic Affairs, for what he brought to the Iraqi government and to Iraq as a person very well known and trusted for his professionalism, expertise, and integrity in the views of international organizations and the international community at large, whether it's nations or organizations. I must say that Ali Allawi has faithfully guarded the Iraqi public treasury to the point where it probably earned him many enemies because most of, this is one of the most thankless and most pressureful jobs to fill, being the one who would be in charge of funding people's legitimate and illegitimate, legal and illegal demands for money. Everybody wants money, and everybody wants money from that person who is sitting at the gate of the treasury. And it was not a fun job to have, but he practiced his day-to-day work with integrity and with professionalism. So let me turn to Catherine and ask you, Catherine, again, this letter that he sent to Prime Minister, which was a very balanced, in my opinion, letter. It listed what was accomplished at the Treasury or at the Ministry of Finance by the government itself, but also honestly outlining the shortcomings, the issues, the challenges that are accumulating from for a long time. And we will discuss later, time permitting, about what he was criticized about, mainly the devaluating of the Iraqi dinar and other measures, and these are very specific technical matters for economists and finance people would know better than those who are watching it from outside that particular field. But what does it mean that he is leaving at this stage? In light of what he wrote in his letter, in light of what we know about what he brings to the table and the way he is viewed and his government is viewed through him by the international community, and how would a post-Ali Allawi Iraqi government, whether it's the current government or the next government, will look like, and in terms of the international interest in issues that have to do with the corruption in Iraq, with all of the other the challenges that are having that Iraq is having, and people like Ali Allawi were at least trustworthy gatekeepers that remained or kept people who are trying to put their hand in the Iraqi treasury, keeping them at bay.
Well, I have to admit that I think I'll defer on the details of Dr. Allawi's resignation to my colleagues on the panel. But I'll just say, and I want to echo my my colleagues in their opening remarks, that I do see a positive role for Iraq in the region. I think that Iraq can play a strong role, bringing this various sides, Iran and the Arab states together, that role that it's played. But just as my colleagues have mentioned, the turmoil and the volatility and just the seemingly incoherence of the government formation process in the last 11 months, and then coming to a height this summer, it does not spark confidence in Iraq and in its ability to continue in a mediation role. It's actually, I was just discussing with somebody, the Academy, of course, hosted the Baghdad conference on partnership and cooperation last August. And there was supposed to be a follow-on summit, I believe, in Amman. And I think it was still supposed to be billed for the Baghdad conference of cooperation and partnership. Now, as I think some of my colleagues have pointed out, the Baghdad conference was long on symbolism. It was short on actual, tangible, deliverables. But the symbolism, I thought, was, at the very least, important. But even the symbolism, how can you hold a follow-on conference, Baghdad conference of partnership and cooperation, when there does not seem to be any partnership or cooperation in Baghdad this summer? The follow-on to that conference has fallen by the wayside. But on Dr. Ali Alawi, I will defer to my colleagues on the panel. But I just want to say, to your point, Dr. Abbas, Dr. Alawi is really seen as a person of deep integrity, and the fact that he has resigned, only deepens sort of the lack of confidence in Iraq's position right now.
Omar, on the same question, what reflections do you have on that? I know you brought the issue of Ali Alawi's resignation in your introductory remarks, and how do you view the post-Ali Alawi era in terms of the issues that he's been working on faithfully and diligently?
Sure. I will join you in praising the legacy of Dr. Alawi. I think if 10 of Iraq's ministers were even half as competent or honest in their performance, I think Iraq would be a very different place. But we are where we are, and obviously his resignation is a loss for the government, is a loss for governance in Iraq. I think the long list of accomplishments that he listed in the letter that were made during extremely challenging and frustrating times, and he did not mince words about the frustrations he's faced, I think are obviously very notable. But what really concerns me is the question of continuity. Will the ministry be able to, and the government as a whole, be able to continue on the same path that Alawi put the ministry on during the past 2 years? And I think the problem lies really with this issue of a weak cadre, a weak intermediate staff and leading staff, senior and mid-level staff in the ministry, and without a solid core to carry on the reforms that were initiated. I fear that a lot of the progress, a lot of the things that are still in the early stages, in the opening stages of their development, programs to reform the banking sector, the payment system, the accounting system for the government, and all the steps that were initiated to advance the reforms outlined in the impressive white paper document that Dr. Alawi led the development of 2 years ago. I think without that continuity, then a lot of that will be at risk of potentially being lost. And the longer this political deadlock continues, and the longer the government formation is in limbo, then I think the risk of loss of progress or loss of momentum will increase further.
Dave and Shamiran, any notes on or any reflections on the question? Dave, I'm especially interested in your views on how would the international organizations such as the World Bank, IMF, and even the US, in fact, government that worked with Ali Alawi and also put a lot of hope on a government that had Ali Alawi as a main pillar in it. What development or what this development is going to affect or not their positions.
So the bigger point is that one of the hardest things to be is an honest person in a corrupt system. And, we've always hoped that, there's a Ramon Magsaysay, one of these generational people who can come in and, impose order and all that. And clearly, when the World Bank, when the IMF, when the US government looks at making funding decisions, what they're doing is placing a bet. And the bet depends on the character of the horse that's running and who the horse is running against. What we know is that anybody representing the Iraqi government has a very difficult ground to run over. There are many obstacles within Iraq and then without Iraq, with Iranian interference and involvement in intimate government decisions. So when somebody has a good reputation, is viewed as incorruptible, when he's removed, the betting shifts and the odds become longer, and people are willing to put less money on the Iraqi horse. I'm sorry for the extended metaphor, but it's the summer racing season at Del Mar, so you can see where my mind is. I think this will be bad for Iraq. I think that people will be involved with Iraq, but the level of commitment will decrease. And, there's a lot of problems throughout the world, and people who might be willing to have made a bigger investment in Iraq will probably say, well, let's look at some of our other priorities. And I think that's unfortunate for Iraq, and I think it's unfortunate for the region.
Shamiran?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really important time. And I think part of this question actually speaks to Dr. Gregory Gauz's question in the Q&A about this kind of how regional dynamics may or may not affect government formation in Iraq. And I think Dr. Alawi's resignation, I think in so many ways speaks to how much this question of government formation has become a kind of a domestic issue more than a regional issue. And that's not to say that these two things aren't reinforcing each other. I think one of the biggest things that is on a regional level that's hampering Iraqi domestic politics is this question of, armed non-state actors. And on the other hand, you have these kind of incursions by Turkey into different, its own spheres of influence in the country. But I think, in terms of regional actors having an impact in government formation, I think that's become less so. And I think that's become less so because we've seen a shift from intercommunal rivalries in terms of government formation and elections and the kind of siphoning out the system along, different kind of intercommunal dynamics, to one where there's, that has shifted towards more of an intracommunal issue, right? Between how different Shia factions coordinate and organize versus, the kind of lack of cohesion between the different Kurdish factions in the north and for example, appointing or selecting a president to appoint as part of the government formation process. And so I think so much of what we've seen in terms of the lack of, or the issues that are affecting government formation have become much more domestic oriented. And a lot of that really speaks to growing intra-communal rivalries versus, any type of kind of necessarily regional influence into the actual government formation process. I think that has shifted towards more regional actors, particularly Iran and Turkey in the case of Iraq now, influencing the proliferation of militias, armed non-state actors, and or actual military campaigns into different areas in the country. And so I hope that answers your question. And I think, I think actually Dr. Alawi alluded to this in his resignation letter, where he talked about how this kind of the lack of domestic instability and cohesion, it's this kind of left the country open to potential even more foreign influence in its domestic affairs. And so we'll see, I think time will tell in terms of where that's going to go.
Great, thank you. And before, I'm eager to go to the questions from the audience, and thank you for picking up Professor Gaz's question. I thought it was timely and to the point, very nicely dovetailed with your presentation on that. But let me, before I get to the questions, ask about the other hot topic on Iraqi politics today, which is the government formation and the development, the turn that it took from what we are used to. We are used to Iraqi government formation as a long process. It takes months always, and from the first election and the constitutional, after the 2005 constitution, the 2006 government formation took months. Same thing with the 2010. And it was heavy dispute about who won, and they had to go to the Supreme Court to decide how the prime minister is chosen. And then to the 2014, of course, with the turmoil and again ISIS coming into the equation, and then finally settling it in an injurious way, the government formation and again, the other 2018 was another example. Every time Iraq had an exciting new experiment on how to form a government and what to expect. And I, in my belief, again, as a watcher of Iraq and somebody who studies Iraq on a daily basis, is really, it's very hard to imagine a swift, fast government formation given the demographic makeup of the Iraqi parliament, given the fact that no one really has anywhere near the parliamentary seats that they need to form a government and have their will manifested under the ceiling of the parliament. There is also the issue of not just intercommunal rivalries, but intra-communal rivalries that are playing around right now at its heart. The Kurdish dispute, they began also before that. It was preceded by some form of a Sunni dispute, and then later on, of course, the Shia dispute, which is really taking a scary turn, I should say, at this moment. So we are where we are. The law is the law. Whether it's the law of the elections or the law of government formation, the bylaws of the Iraqi or the rules, if you will, of the Iraqi Parliament, Council of Representatives, and how the proceedings take place. What the Supreme Court has weighed in recently that made even the process harder than what it was, and created this current stalemate. So, how are you viewing this latest development? We always said, yes, Iraq had many problems and many challenges domestically, but always kept two traditions that are making us hopeful of the democratization journey of the country. One is the regular holding of internationally accepted elections, and second is the peaceful transfer of power. Fingers crossed, we are still in the realm of peaceful somehow transfer of power, but things are on the brink. So let's have Omar maybe walk us through what significance does this act of having the parliament occupied by protesters of one party, and let's face it, it's one political bloc's political base or public base, electorate base that are holding the parliament, and also what does it mean that it is being presented by them as a democratic manifestation of the will of the people, that after all, and at the end of the day, this is the people's house and the people are in it. In some sort, as if we are talking about some Athenian system of all people go to the arena and then have their political views and decision-making abilities exercised. So how do you see that? How different it is from the previous times? And where are we going with this, you think? How does
that's
it
that's the trillion dollar question, Dr. Abbas. I think I and many people who are in this event today have watched and analyzed Iraqi government formations since 2005, and I would be lying if I said that I have a good grasp of what's happening, this time. It is definitely different, certainly different, and I think many of the actors involved in the process, in this chaos that's unfolding right now, are out of that depth. They don't themselves have a strategy for what's going on, and they're taking shots in the dark to see what sticks, what happens. And that's a scary part of it. I think whatever the motivations were, whether they were related to the domestic base of Muqtada al-Sadr or whatnot, the decision to pull out of parliament through the process, I think, tossed the Iraqi government formation process into the unknown. And now everyone is trying, Muqtada al-Sadr especially, is trying to walk back from that blunder. And in doing so, the problem is every action that has been taken is digging a deeper hole. And that brought us to where we are today. So far, I am not really very concerned about the outbreak of violence, because we are seeing a lot of restraint in the protests, in the demonstrations and counter demonstrations between the coordination framework and Muqtada al-Sadr's followers. We have not seen, tactical vehicles loaded with AAA cannons roaming the streets of Baghdad. Instead, we're seeing people in plain civilian clothes and with strict instructions to not attack this, to not cross this, to not, to stay, to keep things peaceful. So people are trying to avoid a fight. And that makes sense, because no one has an interest in war. Everyone, I think all the political parties have an interest in protecting the system, altering it a little bit, of course, to their interest, but in maintaining the system, the structure of the system, the skeleton of the system functional, so that they can have ministers, so that they can have patronage, so that they can have government contracts, and so they can have resources. Where things are uncertain is that as this drags on, and as the actors, particularly Muqtada al-Sadr, do not really have a way out of this, do not have a strategy for extricating themselves from this blunder, things can take unexpected turns. And we're seeing an escalation in personal attacks over the last, I think, 72 hours or so. And my fear is, something like that could spark something that could, take a south turn. But I think I will just sum up by saying that this is unknown territory. We don't know where this is going on. There is an easy path for Muqtada al-Sadr, and that's to kind of like walk back and say, hey, let's sit back. Let's go back to square one, as bad as that may be. But that's a position that a lot of the other political parties are willing to accept. I think yesterday, the statement that came out from the meeting that Prime Minister Kalvani hosted also indicated that a lot of the parties are now more accepting of the idea of early elections. So these are, two ways that can bring, go back to square one, help everyone go back to square one, and try to, get a fresh start on this. Of course, no guarantee that the Iraqi public is going to accept the idea or be enthusiastic about the idea of another early election after they, hundreds of people were killed on the streets demanding early election and a change of an overhaul of the political system. But it could contain the crisis on the political side of political elite side of things. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Shamran, again, following on or continuing on where Omar left off, one of the manifestations of the current dispute is really this level of venomous rhetoric among various groups. And this fits right where you are. A lot of your research really about Iraq focuses on that. This dehumanizing language by one group versus the other. Mostly it started with a zero-sum game that several intra-communal parties played against each other. And then now it turned into really a again, vile kind of use of language and use of terminologies and labeling people of whether it's of the same community or other communities. How unhelpful that can be, and what kind of, again, short-term and long-term effects that it will have on an already injured political process and communal relations.
Yeah, this is such an important question and a really important conversation. I think Omar brought some of these issues to the fore. I think we underestimate how much the early state building period in Iraq, its incoherence in the ways in which the Constitution was drafted and how quick elections were held and how quick the Constitution was drafted. I think what we're seeing today is actually an outcome of all of these things that had been put in place about 20 years ago. And I think that speaks to how sticky institutions can become once they actually take hold. And we're actually seeing the outcomes of that now. And so I think for me, as I watch everything that's happening, I'm not surprised by any of it, because at its core, fundamentally, some of the kind of big, so to speak, original sins of the early state building period did exactly what we're seeing today, which is prioritize elite capture of the state, rather than a state where there are formal institutional mechanisms in place with respect to power sharing and the ways in which power sharing is actually going to play out. Rather, what we have in Iraq is this kind of informal negotiation process that really at its core places centrality for Shia and Kurdish dominance in government, and then bringing in Sunnis as these kind of, junior partners, so to speak, in how the state is run. I think for me, in thinking about other cases and thinking about where Iraq is going, in the way early elections, may be the answer, but I think early elections may actually have a pretty big backlash in the ways in which it'll affect citizen morale in the electoral process itself. And I think that's kind of a dangerous game to play, because if we again go back to, how Iraqis have perceived government formation, government performance, the question of elections, that's been on a steady decline over the past, decade or, 14 years or so. And I just worry that early elections is kind of going to actually ignite that trend and that process even more, and how Iraqis kind of could potentially no longer see elections as a viable, mechanism for changing government. And I say that because in looking at, recent Eurobarometer data, which I was looking at just a couple of days ago, almost 75% of Iraqis that were polled in 2021 believe, don't have much trust in the Council of Ministers at all. And about, 75% are really dissatisfied with government performance. And I think all of these, processes that we're seeing unfolding is going to, affect these perceptions even more. But I worry that actually early elections might have this kind of other effect in the ways in which, the electorate is not going to have much faith in the electoral process itself, because they're going to see that effectively, these elites are using elections as a way of staying in power rather than actually governing. And so I think it's, I don't have much of a positive outlook. The positive outlook I do have is potentially, key stakeholders coming together and ultimately making a decision over these key institutional reforms that need to happen. It's why Iraq keeps coming back to, these crises of government formation. There are serious institutional reforms that need to happen that just haven't happened. And so it becomes this kind of, very negative kind of feedback loop cycle that elites are capitalizing on. But at the same time, you have these, crises that unfold every 3 or 4 years.
Dave, I have a question from Ara Han. Ara says basically, what is the vision of the United States on the current political turmoil in Iraq? The U.S. spokesperson, that's the State Department spokesperson, said that they stay neutrally on the issue of the Shia conflict. But is neutrality, Ara asks, is neutrality enough to preserve Iraqi democracy?
Good question. Let me first go back to what Shamran
and you are welcome
Omar,
to comment on. Yes, please.
Okay, to what Shamran and Omar have said. This is a consistent problem, not just in American, but in Western thinking in the post-Cold War. And lest we blame it all at George W. I served in Bosnia as the military government officer, the liaison between the civil government and NATO forces. And what I saw there was we mistook the trappings of democracy for the institutions of democracy. We fetishized the holding of elections. And in Bosnia under Bill Clinton and in Iraq under George W. Bush, by holding early elections, what we really did was just institutionalize and give a veneer of democratic legitimization to gangsters in Bosnia and to factional elements and probably some gangsters in Iraq as well. So the United States now, I don't speak for the U.S. government. I should have said that at the outset. I'm an interested observer, and I'm somewhat reluctant to dive too deeply into this because Alina Romanowski was the founding director of the institute that I work at. I think that the United States has realized that it has very little ability to actually influence what goes on inside the Iraqi government. What we can do is set the conditions that we want the Iraqi government to meet. And I think as close as you'll see to an intervention in the conditions or a strategy, and I don't think we're really ahead of events there. I think we're mostly reacting to events. But I think my guess is what is being said to leaders in Iraq is, if your government looks like this is what you can expect from the West and the US. And if your government looks like this, you can expect, these things. And I think that the key factors that determine that are electoral responsibility, how much of this is a true election versus horse trading, like we see in the Lebanese government, where you have the Phalange movement aligned with Hezbollah. I don't think that would be a sort of thing that we would welcome. Whether we see a degree of Iranian influence, whether we see people who perhaps don't have a commitment to human rights, but I think all this is instinctively known to everybody who watches Iraq closely. Let me close this intervention on a positive note. When I was on the Joint Staff, I worked Italian affairs for a number of years, and during the period before the Cold War, Italy was in constant turmoil. Aldo Moro, who of course was assassinated violently, had been the prime minister 6 times. Forming a government in Italy, was a circus. And really, Italian government did not kind of become a real government until 1992. We saw political violence. The province of Sicily was under martial law for a period of years, to include in the 90s. 180 people were killed at a train bombing in Bologna. But throughout all of that, Italy maintained involvement in Western institutions. People that were interested in the success of Italy found a way to deal with it in spite of governmental turmoil. And I think that we're looking for ways to do that, to foster the good stuff in Iraq in spite of what goes on in the government. I don't know if we'll be successful, but the real important development here is the regional partners, instead of trying to isolate a contagion in Iraq, seem to be willing to be involved in rehabilitating Iraq in spite of what the circus in Baghdad produces.
Thank you, Dave, and especially thanks for the positive note that you just put. We need as many of those as we can get. Again, when you look at countries, it's different than looking at individuals or families or companies. You cannot close a country as you decide to close a company if it doesn't work. States stay as long as they can. There is also, and what you mentioned here on the U.S. experience in Iraq and several other places, I must note that the recent article by Ambassador Ford about Iraq, rings a few bells on that issue of U.S. choices and, struggle and failures and decisions. One would have loved to see that article 10, 15 years ago. But again, it's a well-fermented set of thoughts that Ambassador Ford just put forward and gave us a lot of food for thought on that. Catherine, let me ask you a question here. And I'm also, you're welcome to comment on what was said a minute ago, but also there is a question from Saman Omar who says, that's a question to you. Do you think Iraq will manage the role of hosting talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the two Middle East neighbors whose rivalry has often played out in Iraq, leading to political paralysis in Iraq, and at the same time keep their national interests develop and progress? You want to unmute?
I'm on mute. Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate all my colleagues' comments on, just before we move to the Saudi-Iran talks. Appreciate my colleagues' comments on just the crisis, the government formation crisis that has really come to a head this summer. And, it does seem like we're moving towards holding early elections. And the tragedy is that, these past elections 11 months ago were early elections. So it's hard to see how, the early elections seems to be kind of like we're moving towards that as the way out. But it's, it hardly inspires confidence given that we're just asking for more elections, in any case, going to the Saudi-Iran talks. So I think the big question among the people that I talk to is, to what extent do, and just to, recap, Prime Minister Khatami has hosted, I think, 5 rounds of talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran at this point. It started in April 2021. I think the last, at the end of June, he shuttled to Tehran and to Saudi Arabia. And, we were expecting to hear, or there was sort of some hints that, the next round might be actually at the foreign minister level. So far, the talks have really been held in sort of intelligence channels, and they've been really close hold. There's really very little about them in the media. And I think actually from my sources, from the people that I talk to, they don't have any information either. It's been really close hold. And I think Khatami has personally done a good job of clearly keeping it, extremely under wraps, which, I hope is, building confidence in him as a mediator and building confidence in the talks. Needless to say, I think it's a really positive sign that there have been 5 rounds, that they, the talks continue to be held. I can talk more so, I think, on the Saudi side than on the Iranian side. I don't think that the Saudis are ever going to not be suspicious of Iran. But I think it's very positive that they, see value in these talks and see value in talking to Iran. So the big question is, to what extent, are these talks, dependent, to what extent is Iraq's role, Khatami's role as a mediator, dependent on the person of Khatami? As I said sort of earlier, he personally has really strong relationships with, had a pre-existing relationship with Mohammed bin Salman. There's also been, I think that actually Khatami and the Iraqis have held talks not only between Saudi Arabia and Iran, they've actually also held talks between Iran and other Arab states, Jordan and Egypt. Again, there's not much information about that, but from what I understand, those talks have happened. And again, Khatami has good personal relationships with King Abdullah of Jordan, with President Sisi of Egypt. He certainly didn't come into his position as prime minister with a strong relationship with Iran, but he's clearly, developed that relationship, or at least sought to develop that relationship. And it seems like he's been successful. So, I think to a large extent, his success it will be hard for a successor just to pick up the ball, assuming that he steps down as prime minister, which, is not guaranteed. He could carry on. That's one scenario. But assuming that he does step down as prime minister sooner rather than later, it's possible that his successor could pick up that ball. But I think that it wouldn't happen quickly because, his successor isn't likely to have the same, personal relationships that he has. But again, and as I said at the beginning of my kind of comments, I think that this is, despite all the challenges that Iraq has internally and in the region, I think that it is existential for Iraq, given that it sits on this precipice, between the Arab world and Iran, between Turkey and the Arab world, between the US and Iran. It is, an enduring interest of whoever is Iraqi prime minister to bring these sides together, and who's ever in the Iraqi government to bring these sides together. And so, I think that will be a constant, even if Iraq is burning to the ground, that will be sort of an enduring constant on the foreign policy front, is trying to bring the various sides together.
Well, thank you for that. We hope that Iraq will be in much better shape than the worst case scenario that you mentioned, Catherine. Very important notes you make. And following up on that, I'm done volunteering panelists, so anybody will be free to answer these questions. My colleague, the Iran Future Initiative Director, Barbara Slavin, asks a very important question in line of what we are discussing. She says, how important is it to Iraq and that Iran revive the nuclear deal? And what would be the negative effects on Iraq if the JCPOA is not revived? And just to add from with Barbara's permission to add a little note to that as well from me. I'm thinking here when I read the question about two possible conflicting consequences of what happens with the JCPOA. One is that's the Iran deal or Iran nuclear deal. One is that there is, as I see it, a possible consequence for what happens with the Iran deal on the security side. And I believe that there is another effect which is not in the same direction on the economic side. So, because on the one hand, any stability and any rapprochement between the United States and Iran, and also it will bring the region with it, that would be, again, means something for Iraqi security and Iraqi security assurances, but also that will have effect on what will happen to the oil flow to the market and the economic side of it. So these are two things, and I would be happy to see reflections from any member of the panel. No volunteers? Should I go back to volunteering people?
I'll just say less on the economic side, but more on, needless to say, a return to the deal would, again, given that Iraq is, trying to bring, all of these different sides together, a return to the JCPOA would just be a more fortuitous environment for Iraq to be able to operate in. The period of maximum pressure, going back to the Trump administration pulling out of the deal and then pursuing a policy of maximum pressure. As we all saw, as we all witnessed, that that played out on Iraqi soil, much to Iraq's detriment. It seemed like I guess like any complicated deal, there are periods where it looks like the deal's dead, and there are periods where it looks like the deal is, alive again. And it's looking like the latter right now. Right before Biden's trip, it was looking more like the deal was not going to happen, or there, much diminished expectations that the deal would happen. And I was really concerned, I was wary for Iraq's sake that, if the deal was not going to take place, if, Biden's trip was going to result in more sort of the Arab states and Israel coming together, that would again be sort of a not fortuitous environment for Iraq to operate in. That again, if there's sort of the polarization, that again, a regional polarization, again, that kind of takes place between, U.S. Arab friends on the one hand and Israel and Iran on the other, that's, just a really hard line for Iraq to walk. But regardless, the outcome of the Biden summit, I was really heartened by, it was a comment that Anwar Gargash of the UAE made, that de-escalation is the name of the game for the coming years in the region. That the coming years, this coming decade can't look like the past decade. And so whether or not we go back, whether or not the JCPOA gets revived, I was heartened that that again, this kind of spirit of detente seems to be taking hold. That the spirit of regional detente seems to be taking hold. Yeah, and I'll stop it there.
I would like to spend a couple of moments on this this next question. It's posed to Dave, but also I would like to hear the comments from Omar, Shamiran, and Catherine, if you like to comment on it, which is on the current water crisis, the climate issues in Iraq. And I think this doesn't get discussed a lot in the middle of the discussions of Iraq, which always focus on heavily, rightfully so, on politics and political developments. But this is a big issue if you listen to the Iraqis and the pulse of the Iraqi street, especially in affected areas such as the south and Diqar, others, the marshes areas. It's heartbreaking what is happening, and there are regional and also domestic dimensions to it. So the question from an anonymous attendee says, if anyone has a point to bring up on the issue of the water as one thing that makes a Middle Eastern country powerful, it was a comment made by Dave. Could you discuss how or if water conflicts play out in Iraq foreign and domestic policy, especially as a downstream state on the Tigris and the Euphrates, and other environmental issues given the ongoing climate crisis? Is this a space where regional coordination has been able to make progress, or, if not, what obstacles are there?
Yeah, well, great question. So let me start off by saying that Iraq is not the only place that has these issues. Of course, the biggest issue is between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt with the control of the Nile waters. And that's just a time bomb waiting to go off. But even in the United States, there's been a new allocation of waters from the Colorado River, which rises in the United States and goes through is critical for several southwestern states, but empties into Mexico. And the United States just unilaterally, we announced a change in water allocation in the various American states. And we also cut Mexico's allocation, which was already pretty low. So
several European states also are suffering right now.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, the Danube and all that. But they generally, I don't think they draw water from it the way the Tigris and the Euphrates are critical from Iraq. So the issue with Iraq specifically is that Turkey announced the GAP plan at the height of the Cold War. And Turkey was, of course, a member of NATO, and Iraq was allied with the Soviet Union, as was Syria. And so not many people in the West gave much thought to this, because it was like, well, to heck with these people. And then, of course, you had the Saddam Hussein and the years of exile and or the years of being an outcast, and the GAP program continued to move while Turkey was considered to be, and still is considered to be, a strong ally of Western interests. Now we're faced with an issue where the water's coming to a crunch. There's not an established body of law that gives down water or downstream states access to the water. Clearly, it's in the interest of everybody to have a reasonable allocation of water, if only to prevent poverty of water leading to political instability. I'm not sure if we're going to get that any kind of an agreement that goes through Syria, given that the waters go through areas of Syria that are controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, which Turkey considers to be synonymous with the PKK, which they consider to be an existential terrorist threat. So there's no incentive to Turkey at all to deal with that river. The other river, Turkey, quite frankly, says, well, this is our water, and we'll use our water as we see fit, and what's left over comes to you. Iraq has the additional problems, as you know, the Iraqi government in Baghdad is not fully sovereign over areas in the northern part of Iraq. So I don't see a solution for it in the short term, aside from Western countries using their influence to get Turkey to see its greatest interest, which is, do you want instability on your southern flank, which already is a security concern for you? Do you want to see this instability magnified by the effect of a prolonged man-made, man-accelerated drought leading to agricultural failure and hunger? I think that the leaders of Turkey are wise to their security concerns. The question is, can we show that this is an immediate security concern that necessitates Turkey foregoing the benefits that can be drawn from taking all the water that they can get their hands on in favor of promoting long-term security in Iraq? I think that case can be made. I'm not sure if it's being made as forcefully and at high a level as it is, but I'd argue it's in Turkey's better interest to promote stability in Iraq through the equitable allocation of downstream waters.
Great, thank you. And I would like to put on my panelist hat and answer one question, and then, of course, the panel is more than welcome to weigh on that as well. And also, after that question is answered or addressed, we would like to conclude, because, believe it or not, we are about out of time. I don't know where the hour and a half went, but I can tell that it is, I could sit here and listen to you for hours, and I'm sure I can speak for our audience. After we finish that question, I would like each panelist to pick one issue of what we spoke about, or an issue that we didn't speak about, and have a minute, 1 minute, minute and a half to give your conclusion remarks on that topic of your choice. But the question that we are going to look at here is from Carmen Mira, who said, Al-Sistani has taken a position on hasn't taken a position on the government formation process. Do you see him taking an active role in government formation in the future, especially if elections are no longer a valid mechanism to change the government? I would like to give, with permission of our panelists, a general sort of answer to that, and you are welcome to comment on it, each one of you. Iraq is different than Iran in terms of the role of the highest religious authority, the Marja'iyya, in their political makeup. The Iraqi constitution does not assign to the Marja'iyya any political role. And also the Marja'iyya has, as Najaf is well known as a school and as a seminary, has advocated that the religious authorities stay away from politics and give a non-binding advisory role to politicians, because they have no constitutional role and they didn't want to meddle in the state. Unlike in Iran, where the Iranian constitution puts the supreme leader, who is a jurist, on top of the political process. And admirably, the Grand Ayatollah Sistani has been faithful to that arrangement, and he has not interfered unless it is absolutely necessary and there is a general interest that in their estimation that can justify such an interference. And the most recent probably example is when ISIS rolled into Iraq and the government was semi-paralyzed and 1/3 of Iraqi territory was lost. The Grand Ayatollah issued a fatwa that recruited a large number of Iraqis to fight ISIS on behalf of the state. It's that kind of magnitude before they can intervene. But also, I would suggest that normally the Marja'iyya is seeing its role as ethical, not political, or more ethical than political, more religious and theological and jurisprudential than actually political. And when they intervene, they want a clear-cut differentiation between right and wrong so they can throw their moral weight behind what they see as right. And the Marja'iyya since 2011 has not seen any side of Iraqi disputants to be worthy of their weight to be behind them and their support. So they closed their doors in face of all Iraqi politicians, and they basically decided not to put their weight behind anyone, because that would intervene, or that would contravene actually their position, which is they are not going to support someone who's being right and being on the right side. Is that clear? So these are the two elements that keeps Sistani out. However, if we see that there is an existential threat to Iraqi people, to Iraq, to the Iraqi polity, the trajectory of Iraqi political life and social life is happening at the magnitude of what they normally intervened on, you bet you will see a position from them that will tip the balance, not towards one disputant or another, but for where the general good of the Iraqi people as a whole will be. And that has been their record, and that is my assessment, and as someone who studied the Marja'iyya for a long time. But also, our panelists have the equal, if not more, right to answer that question if they so wish.
Yeah, I mean, I think going to or piggybacking on Abbas's point, I think it's true that the Grand Ayatollah has kind of stepped in at points of crises, and I think that's been a good thing. And I think that we should expect, hopefully, to see less kind of clerical intervention in Iraqi politics, as a positive development, as we've seen with the policies coming out of the Marja'iyya and also Grand Ayatollah Sistani. I mean, I think this idea that we should expect religious leaders to play a role in politics, I think kind of stifles politics in a way. I mean, imagine like Vatican City and the Pope effectively coming in and deciding when the Italian parliament is going to be formed. And so, I think having that kind of healthy separation is a good thing. And I think what we've seen from the Marja'iyya is this kind of mediating role at certain times of severe crises and nexus points. And I hope we continue kind of to be on that path rather than, having religious leaders kind of be the main sources of mediation. And I think that can backfire in different ways, though it may have short-term, kind of impact, but it can kind of in the long term make politics inherently tied to religious institutions. And I think just from studying democracy comparatively, I don't think that's always been a good thing. And so I agree with Abbas in that assessment that it's actually been a healthy way of separating the role of the Marja'iyya from politics in that sense. And I think there's a good balancing act there. Yeah.
All right, so we are down to the 1 minute or so closing remarks, and let me start with Omar.
Thank you, Dr. Abbas. I'll start with 2 words on water. The water issue, I'll tie that with my conclusions. I think, a large part of the water issue is inflows from source countries, Iran and Turkey, and the failures, I think, of the Iraqi government in securing Iraq's rights reflect, how these countries are, not taking Iraq seriously because of its weak government and its divided political class. But that does not absolve the Iraqi government of, of its responsibility to do its job at home. And that's because much of Iraq's, a lot of the loss is actually happening inside Iraq through evaporation, through pollution, through outdated water management and agricultural practices. This is an area where the international community can help a lot. building really like Iraq's ability to be able to more efficiently use its water. Shortage from the source countries is only one part of the problem. And overall, I think if we're going back to the whole issue of regional diplomacy and Iraq's role, it is very promising, it's very encouraging, as some of my colleagues mentioned, that some of Iraq's Arab neighbors, the GCC, are seeing Iraq as a partner and not as a contagious patient, and they're recognizing some of its potential. But I look forward to the day when Turkey and Iran see the same. And I look forward to the day when Iraq's neighbors do not see Iraq's weakness as an exploitable opportunity for short-term gains. At the end of the day, Iraq's weakness reduces or undermines its ability to address the very issues, the very problems that concerns the entire neighborhood. And so long as Iraq is weak, I think those countries' own interests will not be served. That requires, of course, a paradigm shift in their way of thinking, and it's a long shot. It's a big thing to hope, but one have to say for the record, they need to. I think Iraq's neighbors have to change their mentality, change the way that they view Iraq.
Thank you, Omar. Shamiran.
Yeah, I think just piggybacking on what Omar was saying, and I think that was a really, really good summary in terms of the role of regional actors. I think, Iraq's problems are its own, but I also think over the past 20 years and even before that, we've seen that they're its own to an extent. And I think in looking at the question, the kind of growing concerns for me and something that I've been following in my research and even just kind of observing is the relegation of Iraqi sovereignty. And I think that's happened too often. And I think that actually has directly created pockets of real instability that's affected, civilian populations. And I think if regional actors want to, have that kind of key mediating role to make Iraq a key mediating actor, as it should be, I think there has to be this kind of regional commitment to actually respecting Iraq's sovereignty and its territorial integrity, which actually speaks to the water issues that David had talked about in terms of damming and control and flow, downstream flow, et cetera. And so, I'm hopeful if these kind of issues are taken seriously. But I think, again, time will tell.
Dave?
Let me continue on being little Mary Sunshine here in Pollyanna. My institution does a lot of work with regional militaries, and we recently had a pretty high-level delegation of Iraqi senior officers that were with us for a period of time that included a robust exercise. It's almost a cliche in the U.S. government when there's a problem with another country to say, well, the military-to-military relationship is good. But I can tell you at least the military relationship with the Iraqi Ministry of Defense Forces is extremely good. And just my own interpretation was that the senior officers that we've seen from the Iraqi Armed Forces are probably the most competent regional senior officers I've come across in my 15 years of working with the region.
Catherine, you have the last word for the panelists. You need to unmute.
I'll keep this just really short because I know that we're out of time, but just echoing my colleagues, and in a way, Iraq has this enduring interest in bringing its neighbors together because it is weak. Unfortunately, given the crises of the moment, I don't see that changing anytime soon. But at the very least, Iraq can operate as a pressure release valve in the region. If the regional players want to talk, and that's maybe one of Khatami's. Khatami has been successful on the regional mediation front because of his own personal relationships. But he would not have been successful if if the countries of the region weren't interested in having a mediator and in pursuing détente. And so, to a certain extent, Iraq has benefited from this period of kind of regional détente, and Khatami has been able to personally capitalize on that. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. And please join me to thank the panelists for this excellent presentation of issues that are really very complex to many people. And also, again, within an hour and a half, it's very hard to address everything Iraq. So we thank you for your attendance, everyone in the audience and those who are watching. And also, we promise you that we will address many other issues as we go with several other panels and events to come about Iraq. I cannot conclude without really thanking the people who helped us put this together, in addition to the panelists who generously donated their time and expertise to share with our audience, but also from our Atlantic Council side, Masoud Mustajabi has been great and worked tirelessly to put this together, and also our Atlantic Council's communications team that worked diligently and made this possible through as a virtual event. Again, thank you for your time and wishing you and your families the best of health and prosperity, and look forward to seeing you on other Iraq Initiative panels and events in the weeks and months to come, as we are covering Iraq and everything about Iraq that is developing stories or long-term themes. Thank you again, and thanks to the panelists.